Hi, everyone. I wanted to take a few moments to express how grateful I am to be having this webinar with pioneering researcher Dr. Bill Richards, who has become a mentor and friend. I met Dr. Richards at the ICPR conference a few years ago. I was fortunate to speak after him. And anyone that is familiar with psychedelic research knows the name. So in this talk, we're going to talk about the history, where things are, how things can evolve, what we can do to optimize the evolution of this therapy, and perhaps to touch upon some of the controversies surrounding the research conducted at Johns Hopkins University, and to discuss mystical states and beyond. Really looking forward to this and see you all there. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give a minute for people to settle in and we'll get started. We have a lot of familiar names and faces. It's great to see some mentors and colleagues on the call. Thank you all for joining on a Saturday. Okay, great. I think, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chris. I think people are going to trickle in as we slowly get started. We are recording this webinar, so it will go on our YouTube channel. So those who have to leave or who want to share it with others can share it later as well. My name is Dr. Houman Farzin, and I'm the founder of Mystic Health, which is my holistic health practice now operating in Los Angeles. And it's a real pleasure and honor to have Dr. Bill Richards with me here today. Bill and I met at the ICPR conference in Europe a few years ago. And since then, Bill going from a virtual mentor to an actual mentor and friend. And so I'm really thankful that he contributes his time consistently whenever there is a need. And there's certainly a need, I think, for this sort of conversation to be had at this pivotal time in the field. So, Dr. Bill Richards is a psychologist. He's the author of Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics, and Religious Experiences. He's contributed to psychedelic research as early as the 60s, starting in Germany, and subsequently at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in the 60s and 70s. And he was part of the Johns Hopkins team for over 20 years, starting from the late 90s till 2023, involved in that pivotal work that really helped bring psychedelics from the underground into high standard of academic rigor. And he's currently involved in integrating psychedelic therapy for palliative care at Sunstone Therapies. So, yeah, it's a real pleasure and honor. And Bill, I'll hand you the mic, perhaps just to say a few words, about yourself, and perhaps delving back into the early days of your involvement with psychedelics, how you got involved. We would love to listen on. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you all for your interest and presence. Um, Boy, Yeah, I've only been at this for about 58 years or so. So I've got lots of stories to tell. Um, my entry into the field, very briefly, occurred when I was a graduate student at the University of Göttingen in Germany. I was 23 years old, and the clinic around the corner was experimenting with some new drug that was supposed to evoke memories from early childhood. And I thought that sounded interesting. I went and asked if I could participate. They asked if I got drunk very often. I didn't. Uh, so they led me to a little basement room, gave me an injection, and left me alone. And I braced myself to get some new insights into my Oedipal complex. And to my amazement, this incredible transcendental state of consciousness opened up. And when the research assistant came back in, I said, "What was that drug you gave me?" He said, "It's called psilocybin." I had never heard the term. I hadn't even heard the word psychedelic at that stage of my life. And believe it or not, there was no controversy. In those days, it was the most natural thing for any psychiatrist to receive psilocybin or LSD through the mail from Sandoz and give it to his patients and just see what happened. Um, uh, it's hard to imagine that they were perfectly legal and not only legal, but uncontroversial in those days. So it was a perfectly reasonable thing to give a psychedelic to a graduate student if he wrote a good report, especially. And that's where I found myself. So I had my own experiences, and then I began guiding English-speaking people through sessions in the clinic in Göttingen where the drugs were still legal, especially Americans who wanted to experience a psychedelic before returning to the US. And I've been guiding sessions ever since, except for maybe a 22-year break between 77 and 99 when this whole realm of research became temporarily dormant. Right now, it's charging ahead. It's if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in psilocybin, I think you'll find over 100 current research projects. It's really quite inspiring.
Thanks for that. It's so fascinating. I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on the setting in which you received that injection of psilocybin and the fact that you were left unattended and the nature of your experience. I think it's very relevant as we have these discussions on the necessity of therapy in this work. So I'm wondering how that was for you. What was the setting like, and how that influenced your experience?
Happy to comment on that. Actually, I triggered the discovery of the importance of set and setting in Germany. I mean, they knew about it in Leary's Boston and in the work going on in Saskatchewan with alcoholics, but in Europe at that time, they were still just giving a drug to see what might happen. I think I was saved, if you will, by the low dosage, by my Methodist piety that I believed that God would be with me if any grisly insights from my early childhood came up. So I kind of entrusted myself to my mind instead of trying to observe it and control it. I think that's very important. And also, the dosage was very small. Most of the other research subjects were not having transcendental experiences. They were encountering panic and paranoia and sometimes childhood memories. Uh, And at that time, it was believed that high doses made people psychotic. So you only wanted to give psychedelics in low dosage. Um, Hans Karl Leuner, the psychiatrist in charge of the clinic there, had just written a book, De Experimentella Psychosa, the experimental psychoses. And the hope then was that psychedelics would help us understand schizophrenia and some manic depressive states and so on. But there was little insight into their potential for really accelerating and deepening healthy psychotherapy. But I was this unusual American who had the mystical experience. And then Walter Pankey arrived from America, having just done the Good Friday study, which some of you may know about. And together we taught them how to come out of this little basement room with a little narrow window overlooking the hospital garbage cans to a room with some light and some plants. And we started to use music, Brahms' Requiem, as a matter of fact. And boy, all of a sudden, those high dosage experiences were beautiful and transcendental and meaningful instead of crazy and frightening. And we've been building on that ever since.
That's fascinating. Do you have any idea what the dose was, the dose that you received?
What I received was 13 milligrams of CZ74, which is a short-acting derivative of psilocybin, 4 hours of duration instead of the usual 6. It was a study comparing CZ74 and CEY19, very similar. And the research project actually was agreeing to receive it 4 times with it at 2 dose levels. And the next 3 sessions were not transcendental at all. And I remember at the end of the fourth wondering if I had just been gullible and had misinterpreted what happened. Maybe it was just sensual pleasure of some kind, and I thought it had religious implications or something. But then Wally Pankey arrived and he suggested that I be given a higher dose in a more supportive setting. And that was my fifth psychedelic session in Germany. And I have never doubted the validity of those transcendental states since.
Wow, thank you. What was the timing interval between the doses?
Um, for the first four, I think it was a week, might have been 2 weeks. That was a long time ago, back in 1963. But um,
Yeah, no, because there is the sort of tolerance factor as well, which
mhm.
may have played a role. And do you know what the fifth dose was? Like the
Yeah,
strength?
that was, I think, 27 milligrams, if I remember,
Yeah.
of CZ74, I think, or CEY19, I forget which. And
Yeah, it was the real deal. I mean, that's sort of the standard dose.
right,
You, you know, the
right.
25 milligrams in the studies now. And so you had a mystical experience then. Was that your first mystical experience in life?
Well, I think in that first one, I glimpsed it, or I want to almost say it glimpsed me. It's not something we accomplish, it's something you trust and you receive. The religious folk who say it comes as a gift of grace, I think, are onto something. You know, you can't make it happen, but you can be open willing to go through whatever you need to go through, even if it's some childhood trauma, guilt and grief and whatever. Uh, but then, if the dosage is adequate, often these transcendental experiences open up, either symbolic, archetypal, kind of visionary states, uh, or this unitive consciousness. And it appears that both are in the human repertoire,
Yeah.
and they're incredibly meaningful. Not only because there's a wonderful surge of emotion, but because these states include intuitive knowledge, what William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience called the noetic quality of mystical states. And those states intuitively feel more real, more fundamental than our everyday awareness. They seem to be beyond time and space and substance. And they include insights like our interconnectedness within consciousness, the brotherhood of man, the net of Indra, that if you think you're isolated and alone, you're estranged from the depths of your mind. You've lost touch with your connection with the world. A lot of theological implications come out of this stuff.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, we hear that a lot where, many people have these psychedelic experiences without any support necessarily, let's say psychotherapeutic support, and have these profound life-changing experiences like you had. And we know that due to whether it's regulatory sort of constrictions or just, cost, there is sort of a hindrance in providing proper support for these sessions. I wonder if you see a future where we can objectively assess how someone will respond to the psychedelic, and based on that, let's say, provide the kind of support needed.
Yeah, I would say we know enough to know that the safe, effective use of these facilitators of exploring consciousness, if you will, requires interpersonal grounding, which means you feel safe, you feel connected. You're in a set and setting where you can allow whatever wants to emerge in your consciousness to emerge. It doesn't have to be beautiful or meaningful or ugly or exciting. You just trust your own intuitive experience. And under those conditions, there seems to be, from my perspective, a wisdom that is manifested in the human psyche that choreographs the content that emerges. And for some people, it takes you straight into the transcendental, and perhaps after the transcendental, into some of your life struggles. With others, it takes you through the different psychodynamic uh, struggles of your life, and then you finally break through into transcendence. Both are incredibly valuable therapeutically, and I would trust the person's own mind in terms of how the process is choreographed. The psychedelics are not capricious, like you never know what will happen. Uh, they're very well organized, meaningful if you're in a grounded interpersonal relationship. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Oh, and my image in my book is it's a bit like going skiing. If you just jump on a pair of skis without any instruction and start downhill, that's a pretty stupid thing to do. And you're likely to hurt yourself or someone else, or at least crash into a tree. Okay. And the same is true of psychedelics. If you're going to take a psychedelic, you need to know something of how to navigate in that inner world and to be able to judge whether the time is right for you. Do you have a deep enough relationship established with the people with you to feel safe? If you don't, you shouldn't take the psychedelic. You need more time to get ready for this. Okay. And then there are these principles of navigation, I would say, like uh, very briefly, if there's something frightening, you confront it as fast as you can. You don't try to control it or analyze it or escape from it unless you want panic and paranoia. Okay? It's something in your own mind that's emerging to teach you something. And so, as in the ayahuasca traditions, if you see the great giant anaconda serpent, what do? You dive into his mouth and look out through his eyes. You become your Shakti, your Kundalini. You don't run away from it. Okay? So there's that principle, that readiness not to escape, but to trust the way your own mind manifests itself. And then it's critically important to turn off the intellect, that verbal chatter that wants to put words on everything, and simply collect experiences. And at the end of the day, you can decide what words to put on it. But if you try to explain it while it's happening, you're going to get into trouble, in part because your sense of time may be very different than normal. So intellects are great. They get us through graduate school. But during the psychedelic session, we tell them to go out and play. And when they come back in, we'll give them new stuff to think about. Okay. And then there are somatic sensations of nausea and trembling that are not bad trips or nasty side effects. They're psychosomatic manifestations of emergent content. And instead of complaining about them, you explore them. You dive into the nausea. You exaggerate the tremor and see if a memory wakes up, okay? A whole different approach.
yeah. Yeah, often when we're in session and we reach some sort of standstill and there's nothing emerging, we go to the body, and by feeling the sensations in the body, there is some sort of triggering memory, often from childhood, that emerges and gives the content that needs to be worked on.
Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps the score. Yeah, it's a lot of wisdom there.
Yeah. Yeah, from my personal perspective, Gabor Mate is a mentor of mine, and sort of the connection of our psychological makeup and actual physiologic disease is something that really interests me. And the patterns we see with certain illnesses matching certain traumas and psychological profiles. So I personally see a future where perhaps we can prevent disease by being able to apply these therapies earlier and addressing trauma, and helping people live better lives that way. Um, Have you had the experience of false memories coming up, or just things that come up that are difficult to deal with for people? And how do we navigate uh, challenging sorts of memories that come up that might be disruptive to their current sort of lifestyle? Let's say one that I see a lot is realizing you shouldn't be with your partner. And I know that a lot of sort of complaints against healthcare practitioners take place by partners whose loved one no longer wants to be in a relationship with them. And so I personally always do that assessment and want to have everyone close on board. But do you have any advice on how to navigate that sort of experience?
Yeah, I te I'm not aware of so-called false memories as such. There may be symbolic content, much like a dream at night, that might invite deciphering, exploring, dreaming further. Um, but it's, there's generally insight to be found. It's not just a random being crazy. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, perhaps an exploration of the relationship and the emotions that are emerging and working on that rather than the actual.
that's
Uh,
right. I mean, there are people who um, are stuck in bad relationships or bad jobs, you know, where parts of their lives are not being attended to or nurtured, and they're feeling trapped. There's sometimes the roots of depression are in the relationship, and the relationship needs attention. For some people, a psychedelic session profoundly enriches a relationship, a marriage, perhaps. In others, it may finally give the impetus to say, hey, we've been pretending this is working for several years, it's not working. Let's get into marriage counseling, and if we need to separate, let's separate. You know, that's human growth. That's not a bad trip. You know, let's be honest, let's be open, let's explore where we are, what's going on here. You know, what needs of mine aren't being met, what needs of yours aren't being met. You know,
yeah, I think it's an important part of the informed consent process is to discuss, these sorts of implications of doing such deep work.
hmm
So I think that's one way to mitigate the risk. Do you ever give advice like, don't make any big decisions for the next few weeks after a session?
yeah, definitely. Uh, don't. The first steps of integration after a session often is to apply some of the insights. Uh, if you think I should contact Aunt Agatha I haven't talked to for 20 years, maybe you can write that letter, whatever. But if I want to change my primary relationship, or I want to change my career, or quit school or go back to graduate school or whatever, uh, I would counsel, let's give that a week or two and explore it. You know, don't act precipitously.
Um, I know there's some discussion in the chat about dosing, so I'm just gonna say that in terms of conversion of dried mushroom to psilocybin in a milligram dose form, The typical conversion really depends on the strain of mushroom. So similar to cannabis, where you have various potencies, it's similar with mushrooms. My understanding is that a weaker strain of mushroom, that 5 gram heroic dose equates to something like, let's say, 25 to 35 milligrams of what we administer. As a psilocybin. Sometimes that psilocybin is synthetic. Sometimes it's actually a natural extract. So some of the ones we use through Canada's Special Access Program are a natural extract. And there was a recent study on mice that showed it has more long-standing benefits. But it's hard to study these things in mice. So obviously more research is needed. The other thing
We
that comes
don't
to mind, I'm
we
sorry.
don't work with mice very often.
Right, right, exactly.
But yeah, there are, I mean, when you think there are somewhere around 200 different species of psilocybin containing mushrooms that we know of, not to mention cacti and vines and other sources of psychedelic substances, and how they've been harvested, what other chemicals might be in them, how they've been cared for, contaminated or not, and since they were grown, there's many, many variables. So I know one of my friends who works in the ayahuasca world always uh, tries a small amount of a new batch, and then he judges whether it's weak, medium, or strong. You know? But you can't just be absolute about the quantity. A lot of variance there.
Yeah, in Canada, it's quite easy to order, these mushrooms from websites. And I know that some of the better websites now, they sort of do an analysis and they give you an approximate potency so that you can sort of have an idea of how strong
Yeah.
the mushroom.
But it's not only the strength of the psychedelic, it's also the readiness of the person. We have to remember that some people have these profound experiences with no drug at all. They happen in meditation, they happen in natural childbirth, they happen in sensory isolation or sensory overload, they happen in the midst of creative activity sometimes. Okay. Uh, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, according to Abe Maslow, had spontaneous experiences. They understood transcendental experiences, but as far as we know, they never took psychedelic drugs. Okay. So some people may need very low dosage to have very profound experiences. Others may not be ready to let go, even with rather intense experiences. I remember an engineer in Göttingen who had 500 micrograms of LSD in his system, who thought he saw the air flimmering a little bit. He just wasn't ready to let go, or wasn't able to. So there is individual variance.
Right. Um, I'm wondering if you can talk about your experiences at Johns Hopkins, and the late Roland Griffiths, who got some criticism towards the end of his career and after he passed away, in terms of perhaps being biased in a religious manner, or having a guru complex, or perhaps not adequately publicizing, let's say, the suicide of a patient who was in a placebo arm of a study. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and what your perspective is on that.
Well, as you know, Roland and I began that research, and 1999. So I had a front row seat for all of it. Roland, my beloved friend, was not especially a religious person. You know, he did have a meditation practice that made him open to exploring psychedelics, that he had experienced something quite meaningful in a meditation experience. But he was at the beginning not at all convinced of the value of them. Bob Jesse brought the two of us together, and he wanted to get psychedelic research moving again, and it seemed a reasonable thing to do. Uh, but Roland was quite guarded and skeptical. And over the years, uh, it was almost annoying sometimes because he would want to interview, insofar as possible, everyone who had a psychedelic experience afterwards and hear all the details of the experience. But he was intrigued at the rapid changes in decreased depression and anxiety that many of our research volunteers reported. And most recently, we did this project with professional religious leaders that's still pending publication. Uh, but um, to refer to my friend Matt, um, he went through a stage. I don't know if he's still there or not. We had a little statue of a Buddha in the room, and he would like to remove it from the room before we ran a session. And, you know, I have no objection to that, you know. But in all my 20 years, I don't remember any patient meditating on the Buddha or seeing the Buddha come to life. You know, it was simply seemed an appropriate sculpture to have in the room when I first designed it. And I would suggest that the Buddha is simply the one who woke up. And in that framework, there is a Buddha within everyone. You know, you can't take it out of the room. It's in the room. Um, um, but there were many varieties of experience, some with religious implications and some without. But we were not at all suggesting religious content. Uh, in fact, very good, highly respected atheists and agnostics, uh, not uncommonly had profoundly revelatory forms of experience. Um, so um, I think there were probably many currents of going on at Hopkins there. I was not on site much in the last few years, and I'm not sure exactly what may have transpired between Roland and Matt, for example. Uh, but
Yeah.
the, as a whole, the Hopkins operation uh, has been and continues to be uh, well scientifically grounded. I also feel that the Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, now with a staff of over 85 people, a budget of multi-millions of dollars, moving into new spaces, that its task is to be an interdisciplinary center, you know, that certainly can include good research in psychopharmacology or whatever. But I think the scope of the center needs to be much broader than that. And I think the current director would agree with me on that.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, we all know the importance of set and setting, and some of the criticism is, if we look at psychedelics as these non-specific amplifiers, perhaps let's say amplifiers of, let's say, a placebo effect. My personal view is that it's important that we lay the ground in a way that the session becomes most productive, rather than being
They're
fully.
freezing here. Now we're back.
Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, I was just saying how I think some of the criticism is that we shouldn't set the stage to get to a mystical experience, but I think from my perspective, having a framework in place that perhaps could lead to that sort of experience is a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. And what leads to it is a trust-filled relationship and a sense of privacy, confidentiality. I think it's nice to have reasonable aesthetics in the room, you know, comfortable furniture, or maybe a rose to meditate on if you like, or some fresh flowers or something. But that's not influencing the content of an experience. Uh, in fact, most people are wearing eye shades and headphones through a 90% of an experience. You're not even aware that you're in a room at Johns Hopkins or wherever. Yeah.
Yeah. Someone in the chat is asking in terms of age, like in terms of like let's say an age cutoff from a safety perspective. Any advice on that? If the elderly shouldn't qualify because of
Yeah.
frailty.
Well, the age cutoff is probably different with each research protocol. You know, you specify it in the research design. Uh, there, in the research world, there's been a tendency to avoid older adults because they tend to have more cardiac problems or whatever, and they're just too much too much trouble, to screen out. But in our cancer patients, we've had people in their mid 80s who have certainly had very valuable psychedelic experiences. Uh, so I think everyone should have a good physical and know what the um, risk factors, if any, might be. Uh, but age, uh, actually, on the other hand, I don't know if we've ever accepted anyone under 20 or so, and probably if these drugs are going to be legalized, we need to do some formal research with teenagers and younger people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, they're taking them. It's just not in a research context. So uh, um, the best we can do is try to get the information out to ensure a higher probability of safety for those folks.
Yeah. I can also add that my colleague Yvonne Bosson at Dana-Farber at Harvard just did the study giving 10 hospice patients psilocybin. So these are very sick individuals, and I don't believe they had any significant
No,
bad outcomes related to that.
no, he's even been able to go into the homes of the patients and give them the psychedelics, I think, as opposed to bringing them into a university clinic, which
Yeah,
is,
that's how we started actually in Montreal. The first few patients, we did it in a home care setting as well, and it went really well.
yeah, what would life be like if this was normalized? If, if cancer care centers and just offered psychedelic therapy as a perfectly reasonable option for those who would like it, to minimize depression, anxiety, help you deal with the knowledge that, like everyone else alive, you are mortal. you know, let's make peace with that and live fully. You know.
That's the goal. Speaking about young people, I'm wondering if you have any comments on sort of psychosis and the association of psychedelic use with psychosis. Um, do you feel like there is enough knowledge to be able to make any, you know, recommendations or any sort of conclusions, or do we just need to do more research on that?
Yeah, I think that's basically an area that we honestly don't know much about. Lauren Mosher and there was Soteria House in San Jose, California, where they uh, viewed psychosis, the initial psychotic break, if you will, as a need for grounding and support, and treated the psychosis very much like a psychedelic experience with inpatient care, but lots of support and music and art therapy and all this good stuff. And that was a very promising beginning that, as far as I know, is kind of on hold. When someone first has a psychotic break, what usually happens from my perspective is that the police are called in the middle of the night. They handcuff the person and put them in the rear seat of a police car. They take them to an emergency room where they may sit alone for most of the night before a psychiatrist sees them in the morning and then maybe gets an antipsychotic med. That's not the way we run psychedelic research, you know, and how different it could be if when there is a crisis, there could be warmth and support and maybe even use of music and kind of help at least some of those people to to kind of go through a psychedelic death and rebirth, if you will, to reconstitute the controls of the ego in a safer way. Might not work for everyone, but it might work for some. And I think it's an area of research waiting. We need some universities who will do psychedelic therapy with on an inpatient ward with a well-trained staff and welcome the people who come in the middle of the night.
Yeah. I remember one of the points in medical school where I was considering becoming a psychiatrist, and I worked at the first episode of Psychosis Ward, and seeing how care is provided for these individuals was so heartbreaking that it sort of changed my mind, and I decided to do family medicine and stay holistic, especially because Gabor at that time, was advising me. um, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on a spiritual emergency, and if there is such a thing to distinguish, let's say, spiritual emergency from psychosis.
Well, it's a different way of labeling it, that's for sure. Um, I think at this point in my life, I come from Teilhard de Chardin's perspective that I think it's very reasonable to believe that we are all spiritual beings who are having physical experiences right now. Okay. And we're, it's strange, we forget the spiritual dimension of our lives. And that's where love and values and appreciation of beauty comes from, as well as the creeds of different organized religious systems in the world. And there's something very basic, very important there with profound implications for world peace. And I don't think we should be apologetic about that. That often with psychedelics, people discover a spiritual dimension within their minds that they never knew was there. And I can tell you from a lot of experience, it happens in perfectly good agnostics, you know, and they can choose what words they want to put on it. Uh, but there's something incredibly meaningful and beautiful that opens up in their minds that probably is at the source of all the world religions. We call it, in religious language, we call it revelation, you know? So this is a huge frontier for religious scholarship as well as for medicine. And I would also stress it's a huge frontier in education, you know, in different disciplines from music to literature to depth psychology, you name it. Um, Heck, if you really want to understand Plato, instead of just reading Greek in the library, you could experience what Plato experienced. Wouldn't that be a valuable form of experiential learning? And that this can be done with a non-addictive drug when it's used wisely and safely? To me, that's good education.
Very interesting. I'm wondering if you can speak about music. I know you're a musician, and you've been using music since the early days, and the playlists that many still use. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on music and how you see its importance and even the philosophy of just music. Like, why is it so deep for us as humans?
Yeah. Well, one can have a powerful, meaningful psychedelic experience in total silence. Okay. Um, it's hard to find total silence, frankly, because people sneeze and doors creak and air conditioning systems come on and off and birds chirp and usually there's always music of some kind in our uh, world. But it's my experience that structured sound, what we usually call music, if well chosen with appropriate dosage and timing, can significantly deepen the states of consciousness experienced and also are supportive in ensuring the safety of the inner journey. Uh, the music does not cause the content of an experience, but the structure of the sound can enable one to move through potentially challenging material uh, and to, as we say, trust, let go, and be open. Now, clearly, this depends on uh, who you are, where you are in your life, what phase of drug experience and what dosage uh, you may be using. In the early days of designing playlists, for example, we tended to not use music with words in the language of the person because we didn't want the intellect to try to decipher the words. And yet the human voice is a very maternal supportive instrument in the orchestra, if you will. You know, a soloist, a choir can be quite beautiful, but we would opt for it in an unfamiliar language. Um, we would also, in designing playlists, think of music before you take the drug when you first come in, just kind of pleasant background sound. And then music as you're waiting for the drug to take effect and the initial ascent. All of a sudden it's opening up, uh, you're going somewhere. And there you, especially for someone having their first session, my choice would be music with a strong unfolding structure, not music that's kind of wandering aimlessly in the meadow, but music that's going somewhere. There's a thematic progression, as in a Brahms symphony, for example, or Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings, or Elgar's Ninth Enigma Variation, or something like that. And then there's the peak period, if you're lucky enough to go right up beyond the ego. And then there's no you listening to the music anymore. So it's the structure of the sound itself that you may not even hear, but if you start to reconstitute the ego, it's there to receive you, to welcome you back, sort of. And then, at the end of the day, if it's been a good session, you can probably appreciate just about anything. It's kind of fun to explore other uh, styles of music. I can even appreciate bagpipes then, and usually I don't like bagpipes at all. Okay. It's an openness, willingness. Well, oh, yeah, I'll try this on. Well, that's interesting. Why not? Uh, so generally, people value the music that happened to be playing when they had meaningful experiences. But I think the personal preferences, the ordinary tastes, if you will, of either the patient or the therapist are really not very important when when you're dealing with high dose psychedelic sessions. And there's some music that we've used for decades that has simply passed the test with lots of different people from different cultures, different religious and non-religious backgrounds. Uh, just music we've discovered works well for many people, and that's what we tend to use these days.
Has your view changed on the, music in a familiar language? Is that less important now in your view?
Yeah. Well, for example, my first experience uh, in Germany, the fifth one I mentioned earlier, was supported by Brahms' German Requiem, and I've loved that. I try to sing it at least once a year in one context or another, um, and it was a very good choice. Wally Pankey recommended it on the basis of what they were using in Boston. You know, it had a history to it that many people had found it helpful. Um, and I do know German well. So, I could uh, decipher the words. But I think right now I would, in my mind, if that was playing during a session, I would probably say, I know this is familiar, but I'm not even going to try to label it right now because I don't want to activate my intellect, uh, the cognitive thinking capacities, the labeling, the language. I want to trust the intuitive content that's emerging. You know? But if I was insecure or and was trying to decipher the words, I think that would be a way of controlling, of fighting the experience that might engender tension, distress, panic, and even paranoia.
Thanks for that. Two things come up. One is your son Brian showed me the research on bird song and its relaxing effects, and the fact that it was used at Sunstone sort of early on before the session. So
Yes. Yeah.
I've been using that. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's something just very relaxing about hearing birds chirping, you know? It's like the beginning of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is one of my colleagues here at McGill, Kyle Greenway, is doing some really interesting research with music and sort of talking about it as like a therapist or a sitter in the room. Without the music, we have to do more work in a sense.
Mhm.
And I was part of a recent publication with him, a case report on a group psilocybin therapy we did, and just speaking to patients about their experience with silence, or it's called the sound of silence. And you're right that it's never pure silence. There's always some ambient action.
Yeah, my friend in Germany, Peter Gasser, or Switzerland, I guess, is very fond of periods of silence and argues for them. Um, and I know where he's coming from, but in my experience, when there is silence, people tend to kind of come out of their experience. All of a sudden, yeah, here I am at Hopkins and I'm lying on a couch and it's the fourth day of September or whatever it is, you know? And there's something about music that keeps it flowing. So you're more like a piece of driftwood in a river. You're going somewhere. Things are unfolding, things are happening. And also in silence, you hear, as I mentioned earlier, the creaking in the doors and the sneezing and you know, there's still sound, you know, and pure silence is hard to come by.
Yeah. We typically end at an hour, but we had discussed that we can go a bit longer. If
Sure.
it's okay with you. There's someone in the chat asking if you knew Joan Kellogg. Uh,
Yes. Yes. Joan Kellogg was a very fine art therapist who worked with us at Spring Grove in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. And she developed a way of working with mandalas, where we would invite people to just we would give them a piece of paper and a dinner plate you could outline in pencil, and then a set of oil pastels and the instruction to just do whatever felt intuitively right. And people would produce these wonderful works that then she had a system of deciphering or interpreting them. And it's a very interesting um, approach that has a lot of validity with many people. For example, people who are very controlling, obsessive compulsive people tend to use lots of right angles.
hmm,
Alcoholics would make everything paisley, very just flowing curved lines. Very interesting. And of course, the ideal Tibetan mandala has circles within squares within circles within squares. It's both and, you know. And she had theories about the meaning of different colors and so on. Very interesting, very creative woman. She was a very good member of our team back then.
amazing. Um, that individual Rebecca is asking if you ever made mandalas yourself.
Yes, yeah. Um, I don't think I have any of them right now. It's it's a good thing to do in preparation and all, to uh, do a drawing and come in and share your associations with it with your therapist. Why not? It's a nonverbal way of communicating content.
That's
I mean, there
interesting.
are people. I remember a seriously psychotic person who would only use black and red, even though all the other colors were there, you know? And that's worth talking about. Is that death and life? What's going on here?
Very interesting. Yeah, we use Mondel as an integration mostly and after holotropic breath work, but I never thought about using it in preparation. It's a pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, though it was Stan experiencing it with Joan that got it integrated into holotropic breath work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Um, I'm wondering if you have any concerns with the movement, perhaps with the commercialization of it, and if you have any sort of advice for how to best support this movement in the most productive way.
Well, I am not much of a businessman. I do have a private practice, but um, when it comes to making these, I would say sacred, potentially sacred chemicals available and safely distributed, I mean, that needs to happen. You can't give it if someone doesn't make it. And to make it, you have to make a profit of some kind, at least maybe not an outrageous profit, but the company has to function. And so there, on this frontier, we need people with a lot of different strengths and qualifications to launch it. And uh, the corporate business, corporate um, facets of the frontier are certainly inevitable, I think. And I think I'd like to think they can be implemented in psychedelic, if you will, caring, compassionate, reasonable ways. Hmm.
Thank you. Some are suggesting doing pre and post mandalas and comparing it as a research project, which I think with AI is something interesting that can be done.
Yeah, actually, we did that with a number of our patients at Spring Grove, and it was often dramatic. It would capture the process of therapy and the beginning and the discharge point. It was often amazing. I mean, someone untrained in art therapy would recognize uh, the struggle and the conflict of the early mandalas and the clarity and affirmation and strength of the latter mandalas. It was really quite impressive.
That's fascinating. Someone's asking about the painting behind you. If there's a story to that one.
Yeah, well, that's painted by my partner, Edna Emmett, who is a real artist. And that one she happened to give to me a number of years ago. I know how much you can see of it, but it's one I'm very fond of. Uh, EdnaKurtzEmmett.com if you want to look at her other art. It's there.
Thank you so much. Um, any word on sort of the indigenous and their contribution to this, and perhaps, I don't know, any suggestions on reciprocity there?
Yeah, well, I'm all for reciprocity. It's a two-way street. I think we have gifts to give one another. Um, I mean, all indigenous use is not identical. All research use is not identical. There's infinite variations on both sides. But actually, Australian filmmaker, um, Lynette Walworth, has just completed a very fine film uh, that includes uh, researchers from Australia going to take psychedelics with indigenous people and indigenous leaders coming to their clinic in Australia to complete the dialogue. And it's really very fine. And you'll be hearing about that in the next year. It'll probably be at the next Sundance Festival and so on. But it's
That's
uh,
fascinating.
let's see if I can dig up the name of it here. Edge of Life, I think, is the name of it.
Thank you. Can you spell Edna's last name again?
Yeah, it's Emmett, Emmet. Edna Kurtz, Kurtz, Emmett, Emmet. Yeah.
And the movie, sorry, back to the movie, is Edge of Light for Edge of Light.
Um, Here it is. Edge of Life, Edge.
Edge of Life.
Produced in Australia by Stranger Than Fiction Films.
Oh, interesting.
And it's just been finished. It should be released in the year ahead.
I see. What about the painting that's on the floor, sort of peeking out on the floor, leaning on that little desk behind you?
Oh, that's just a pillow.
That's a pillow. Okay, cool.
No, that's just covering a hole in the furniture.
Okay, nice. Great. I don't know if I've answered everyone's questions, but this was such a fascinating conversation. It's always enriching. Thank you so much.
Well, let the research and the frontier continue to unfold, and thanks to all of you who are participating in it and contributing to it and helping to educate the masses out there about how to use these substances wisely and responsibly. The benefit could be immense. Imagine if we really approach death differently in Western culture, for example. Uh, there's so much psychological distress that's fueled by unresolved grief and the trauma of people dying without reconciliation and forgiveness and insight. You know, we can do something about that.
Definitely. Yeah, I see it all the time in palliative care work. There's a lot of room for improvement there. Um, any comments on randomness? I have a question, I guess, in terms of things meant to be versus randomness.
randomness.
Mm,
Nothing particular comes to mind. Uh,
yeah. Um,
Certainly, our research volunteers as a whole have been a very random group, you know, um, and different ages, different sexes, different uh, ethnic and racial backgrounds, um, religious and non-religious orientations. Um, and most people have benefited from psychedelic therapy. And frankly, I know of no one we have treated who feels they've been harmed. That says a lot.
yeah. Um, One of the experiences commonly reported in these states is how everything has sort of led them to that moment, in a sense that it hasn't been random, but everything is sort of designed in a certain way. Do you have any thoughts, viewpoints on that? Is it truly random, or is it sort of all part of this?
Is there a time for each of us to begin to wake up more fully? I don't know. Uh,
If
well,
people
at
want,
least so far as these substances awaken us to what has always been there, what's part, the essence of being human, perhaps. Why should that ever have been considered illegal? You know, what are we afraid of as a culture? And sometimes I think that within our minds, there may be a good bit of unresolved guilt and grief, maybe not only from our personal lives, but from the history of our um, the last several hundred years, you know, and maybe we're afraid of some of the guilt and grief that needs resolution. So we want to make these drugs illegal because they wake us up to unpleasant realities that need to be faced. That's one hypothesis. Or are we just so afraid of joy and love and peace that we make it illegal to really penetrate into the depths of the human mind? I don't know, but I'm profoundly impressed at the rapidity of healing and personality development that can occur with the responsible use of it, psychedelics. Well, it's great to be together on this threshold. We're both deeply committed to Therasil and especially the applications in palliative care. That could be the first realm to make totally legal.
hopefully. All right, so enjoy the rest of your Saturday, Phil and everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Okay.
All right, take care.